circumstances. But David Stern meant so much to so many people. I'd love for you to share just a little bit about your relationship with him.
Oh, wow. I go back, I used to work in Milwaukee in the 80s when David Stern took over. And so I sort of go back to at least the start of his commissionership. And, even a little bit before that, I worked in Minnesota. They were trying to get an expansion team. They finally got one. That was a major accomplishment for the commissioner. I know, the addition of so many teams during his tenure was a real source of pride, and he took great pleasure when those teams actually excelled. Minnesota had some hiccups in there. They nearly lost the franchise. And so a lot of communication, conversation with David Stern about that as well. So, I've sort of been around, fly on the wall kind of a thing for his whole run. And I was a little surprised at how much, his passing affected me. We keep things at arm's length if we're doing our jobs properly. And yet, great admiration for a guy who was tough as nails. And he really did, in my opinion, look out for this league like a tough love parent.
Very well said. And I think you're exactly right. I'm sure that emotions were running high. We showed a tweet from Mark Spears where he spoke about an emotional Magic Johnson. Was there a high point, emotionally speaking, for you where maybe you had to gather yourself? Was there a surprise moment when a speaker said something that really hit home?
Well, Magic's reflections up on the stage at Radio City Music Hall, to me, were particularly poignant. And I write about this for my piece on NBA.com, that just as we were all there, sort of restoring some order to what's gone on, over the last 2 months regarding David Stern. The idea that Magic Johnson was eulogizing David Stern, in essence, made sense and really kind of fixed things from what we all worried about 29 years ago. And that, Magic talked about that and how helpful David Stern was to him during that horrible time of the HIV news. And, most people thought that it would be Magic who would be gone first. And the fact that the chronology played out, Magic Johnson is 60 years old, and he is saying goodbye to his friend who was 77. That makes a lot more sense. And I think a lot of us walked out of that building today feeling that, okay, we get this now. Closure's a cliche, but I have to say this feels better than it felt on January 1st or 2nd or the days since then.
Absolutely. Time will heal things as we move on, of course. I spoke with a couple of people who were there, and they said that it had the feel of an NBA family reunion. I know you mentioned closure. A memorial service is never a fun moment to get together, but oftentimes it can become a celebration of life. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how that felt when all of those former players, executives, team personnel, Val Ackerman was there, I heard, from the WNBA days. What did that feel like being in that room?
Well, it was very special. And while, NBA fans would look at that and look at the who's who of people that were there, whether Hall of Fame legends, current players, coaches, general managers, executives, anybody. It really was a cross-section of the league. I think that they all enjoyed being there. And as you said, the word family, there is a sense. And this used to be a real mom-and-pop kind of a league in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And now it's become a global juggernaut. And yet the people that have helped make it that, do feel a closeness. Everybody really does know everybody. And I think that sense of sharing this and learning some things about David that, in the wake of his passing, everybody talked about, his tough approach to business and a negotiator and the way he dealt with players or coaches who fell out of favor. And, a little bit you got about the twinkle in his eye while he did it. But we really got personality and background today. And to me, it was very interesting, and it just all sort of put things in order.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your perspective and your insight, sharing with us what that memorial service felt like on the inside. Steve Ashburner.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Well, as we mentioned, it's never a fun day when you are memorializing someone. But someone like David Stern, who meant so much to so many people, His two sons were the last to speak there, so I'm imagining that that was very emotional to listen to. We all have our David Stern stories.
Right.
I probably wouldn't be sitting in this chair right now if it weren't for David Stern. He had the courage to appoint me as an assistant coach when the D-League was first starting. I was the very first female to coach professional sports. He had faith in me to do it, and he had chats with me before the season started to make sure that we were all on the same page and that I was prepared and ready for it. And from that, everything took off for me. So I owe everything to David Stern.
And just him just being open-minded enough to say, hey, kick down that barrier, because like you said, they weren't allowing women to coach or have those type of opportunities, and what it led to for your career. And he was big in that aspect, whether it was starting up the WNBA, really trying to make sure female reporters got their fair share in this business in the NBA back in the day. People like Jackie McMullen talked about David Stern opening doors for her to be able to go in locker rooms and get these interviews. And David Stern, he meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but the biggest thing you can say about him is he had a vision for more than just where basketball was at the moment when he took over the game. When he was the commissioner, he saw basketball being more than that. Hey, we got to include everybody. We have to include females. We have to make sure that our African-American players are marketed differently than a lot of other sports. We have to tell their stories. Guys like Magic and Michael, those guys really carried the league in the 80s. So David Stern did a great job with how he marketed this league, and then taking it global, that's another aspect of it as well.
Yes.
So his stamp will forever be on the NBA, and that'll be my legacy for David Stern, is that all the different aspects that he brought to this league.
It's unbelievable. And Yao Ming was present. Current Commissioner Adam Silver said he traveled the furthest distance and was a surprise guest today. So it's not just about NBA basketball, it's the world that David Stern affected. Zion Williamson expected to make his debut tomorrow for the Pelicans. Can't wait.
Brought to you by Ford. Built Ford proud.
Our goal is freedom. I believe we will win it right here in Atlanta. Atlanta must not fool herself any longer. We must be willing to suffer when necessary, go to jail when necessary, and even risk our lives to become witnesses to the truth as we see it.
My father loved the city of Atlanta, of course, because this is where he was born. He grew up here, he was educated here. He wanted to make sure that he lived in the community where the people were.
He was a product of the Atlanta streets.
Well, tried to be good, wanted nothing but to love somebody.
There are a lot of memories on the West 100th Street. Pascal's Motor Hotel, a very historic gathering place for members of the Civil Rights Movement.
Most of the meetings of the Civil Rights Movement were held in its ballroom. The center of 100th Street was the Atlanta University complex. Atlanta University Center was the intellectual center of Black America.
1966. It was along Hunter Street, King led one of his last protests in his home city of Atlanta, demanding that Julian Bond be seated in the Georgia state legislature. To that point, he had been denied access to his rightful seat.
He was dismissed because he opposed the war in Vietnam.
We are going to see that day right here in Atlanta, Georgia, when Julian Bond will be back in that state legislature.
Sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the wake of King's assassination, Atlanta, and particularly Hunter Street, became a central gathering place for the world, watching the funeral procession.
I didn't know what to expect. I was trying to get my friend and brother comfortably in the ground. We expected it to be a crowd, but we didn't expect all of America to show up.
There's a whole lot of people gathered on that day.
The street was literally solid people as far as you could see to downtown Atlanta. Later, I was surprised that they really underplayed the number of people that were there. When you watch the news reports, it usually referred to tens of thousands. And I'm sure there were several 100,000 because you couldn't fill that much space solid without having that many.
The first city that we know of that named a street for Dr. King was Chicago, just months after King's assassination in 1968. When you think about Atlanta and you consider the fact that it took at least 8 years, one wonders why it did take so long.
I was a little embarrassed that it took us as long as we did.
Wyche Fowler was on the Atlanta City Council during much of the debate over naming a street for Dr. King.
I thought it was a wonderful idea and high time that we honored our own.
Martin Luther King Street in Atlanta was formed from 3 older existing streets. The initial proposal and the activism behind it was directed by Mr. Morris Finley, a city councilman at the time.
On this side of the community, we got generals that's being honored.
Gordon Drive, named after John B. Gordon, a Confederate general.
On that side of the community, we got generals being honored.
Mosley Drive was named for Hiram Mosley, a Confederate doctor turned businessman, and Hunter Street, named for Alston Hunter Green, a prominent planter and slave owner.
I want to honor black folks. And I sat down and I started looking at all the people who were my heroes and sheroes. The leader was Dr. King.
Even though some people may think that naming a street is a pretty easy task or a relatively simple matter, street naming was an act of activism. It was an act of going out and generating public support and dealing with public opposition. And in fact, Mr. Finley exactly found that. He actually tried to get multiple streets named for Dr. King and ran into opposition and struggle.
What I wanted to do is build the entire box that we was in. I ran into problems.
There was a general anxiety within the city of Atlanta, personal and political rivalries going on within and between the white and black communities within Atlanta about exactly how much they wanted to identify with King and exactly where best to remember him within the city.
I'm sure there were some that did not want to have their businesses on a street named after a prominent black man.
I chose a street I feel would be no opposition. Hunter Street. Here we go again with another one of the generals.
Martin's movement was, from the very beginning, to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. Old Hunter Street, going right straight through the black community, was a pathway through poverty.
It may seem strange for me to say this, but I don't think that it was primarily a racial matter.
My greatest opposition were black folks.
The people who live and work and have their businesses on streets don't like change.
Everybody wants to protect their own. So now I go to explain, hey, do you know this guy right here killed all these people who fought in the Civil War? Didn't make no difference. That means you got to change my stationery.
They don't like to have to tell everybody that they have a new address.
If you really want something, you know how to eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
When the street was named, I thought it was very significant that it was a street that went into the downtown community. During my father's life, he could not go into that downtown area.
Once it happened, it's impossible not to have a little ego trip whenever you go under that sign.
It was speaking about a new way of looking at Atlanta's history.
I, too, had a dream. And I got mine in black and white.
This is a man who, when he was assassinated, he was one of the most hated men in America. Now, he's one of the most loved men in the world. And that's evident by so many things. The streets that are named after him, it just happens to be one of those many ways.
I take the naming of the streets of the nation after Martin Luther King as a promise. If we think putting up a sign on a street is paying tribute to this man who gave his life for this nation, street's not worth a damn.
Martin Luther King Jr. Drive is depressed. What we invested in as older people did not turn around and reinvest in us. And so you see neglected streets.
The streets in almost every city go through poor neighborhoods.
When a lot of cities did begin to name their streets for Martin Luther King, I think it was Chris Rock.
His routine was, if somebody calls you and says,
I'm lost, I'm on Martin Luther King, run! Run! It ain't the safest place to be.
Dr. King didn't dream of a city that was in disrepair. So what we have envisioned in Atlanta is an ML King Drive that is befitting of Dr. King's legacy.
We really need the people that we invested in to come back and invest in us and our neighborhood.
It should be a source of pride for everybody.
It's a reminder that we still have a lot of work to do.
We need to invest a lot in transforming these communities so that they truly live up to the icon.
If we take it as a promise that we should turn Martin Luther King's streets throughout our nation into avenues of hope and promise for the least of these God's children, whatever color they may be, nothing could make Martin Luther King more proud.
it's about repairing a community or repairing inequality. There is no other street like it.